All right, let's talk Dallas Cowboys. I'm Nick, and this is our daily Cowboy show. It is game day, primetime matchup this evening against the Green Bay Packers. Tough matchup for the Dallas Cowboys, obviously. We got some interesting news, and I think some good stuff ahead of the Packers matchup, but some really good stuff for the long term. But as we always like to on this channel, get things started with a little palate cleanser, little stat of the day, if you will. And let's just highlight something I saw on social media. I think it's really important to kind of point this out. And this is a courtesy of the X account Ferg Season, talking about, I guess, a Ferguson fan account. They posted Dak Prescott is only 1,947 yards away from solidifying his spot as the all-time passing leader for the Dallas Cowboys. He is also not too far away from being the all-time completions leader for the Dallas Cowboys as well. And on that same token, not too terribly far away from being the all-time touchdowns leader for Dallas as well. So again, obviously it's a new era. It's different than the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and things like that in terms of the passing numbers. They get hyperinflated, right? If you look at where, the per game and per season numbers just going back 20 years ago versus where it is now, it's obviously a different football world. Of course, you've got a 17th game. For a long time there were 16. For an even longer time there was only 14 games. So, it's not apples to apples. I don't think anyone is saying Prescott is better than Staubach or Aikman or maybe even Romo in some ways. But I think one of the interesting things I will say to Cowboys fans is you have to appreciate what Prescott has done up to a point in terms of being very productive and very stable for a very long time. He came into the NFL in 2016. Guys, it's 2025. I mean, if you look across the National Football League, Dak Prescott right now is the longest tenured starter currently with the same team. That's impressive, right? Now, a lot of that, of course, is because Jerry Jones and the Cowboys leadership really likes Dak, but credit has to be given where credit is due when it comes to Prescott maintaining his level of performance. And so far through 3 games, he's had a really good season. And look, whether you love Prescott, whether you hate him, or whether you're kind of in the middle, it's undeniable. He's been a stabilizing force. When Romo was getting injured at the end of his career, there was a lot of question marks of, oh my goodness, is this 1999 again? Is this 2000 again? Dak Prescott stepped up, and it's been stable, except for, of course, a few injury-riddled seasons for the past decade. So credit to Prescott for what he's been able to do at the quarterback position. All right, let's get into the news. So this was interesting stuff over the course of the week, and this is from a Packers reporter talking to Green Bay Packer Tucker Kraft. He said Tucker Kraft says he's looking forward to seeing Kenny Clark in Dallas. What Clark meant to the Packers. Kenny Clark was kind of that person people would look into the sense of, what do we need to do? He was a walking standard, right? And there's a lot of commentary from Packers players, and there are a lot of people in Packers social media and Packers media that said, listen, we're excited that we got Parsons. We're a better team because we have Parsons, at least in the short term. But boy, Kenny Clark was such a great leader. Boy, he was such a stabilizing influence. Boy, he was the standard. He was the great locker room guy. He was a great culture guy. It really stinks we don't have him. He was a good, complete player. And I think one of the things when we look back in a few years from now that'll be interesting about this Parsons trade, whether for the Packers or from the Cowboys perspective, is obviously if Green Bay wins a championship, they'll say they won it. If Cowboys in a couple seasons start playing really good football, they'll say they won it. We'll have to wait and see, of course. But I think one of the things that'll be interesting to see is, did the Green Bay Packers here kind of pick up their own Terrell Owens in a way, and in terms of sacrificing some locker room stability and some quality culture that Kenny Clark helped build, right? And it is an interesting dynamic. It is something to keep an eye on, that Kenny Clark so far is just saying and doing everything absolutely perfect. Let me give you another example of this. This is from another report. This is from, look, I'm not going to even bother trying to pronounce it, Weston Hodkowitz. I think that's probably close. When this was earlier this week when Kenny Clark was asked about Green Bay. Kenny Clark on the Packers organization, I don't remember a day that I didn't love coming into work. That's just what I love to do. I love to play football. I love being around the guys. I built a lot of bonds with those guys. I want to be remembered for all that kind of stuff. Again, so this is just perfect, right? You're talking about the perfect answer in front of the media, right? He's not, compare that to a lot of what we said with Micah Parsons, right? Micah Parsons is like, even Micah Parsons hasn't been saying anything bad or anything like that. He says, man, it's going to hurt to get a sack. Man, I'm talking about, he's talking about whether it's a good or a bad thing, that there's not going to be some tribute video or anything like that. Look at Kenny Clark, right? Look where he's talking. He's talking about the relationships. He's talking about the people. He's seeing nothing but good things about Green Bay. He's no longer a Packer, obviously. Nothing but good things. What do you see from former Packers players? Nothing but good things about Kenny Clark. I think it speaks to what this new Dallas Cowboy brings to the Cowboys organization and what he will bring going forward. I know a lot of people are focusing on the draft picks in the camp space, and that is true. That is the future. But don't undersell Kenny Clark's impact on a football team in terms of the long term, especially when you're dealing with a very young Cowboys team. I mean, they're a young team. I think Going into the season, they were the second or third youngest team in football. Obviously trading away Parsons, it shifted things maybe a little bit, but they're one of the younger teams in football. And even that's with Dak Prescott being a veteran quarterback. Now you look at Kenny Clark being a veteran presence with a lot of these young guys on defense. You talk about a perfect addition. You talk about a perfect mentor. You talk about a standard bearer. These are these kind of players. That's exactly what I go back to my Bill Parcells analogy that I've talked about when it comes to Schottenheimer yesterday and for a while now, is that Bill Parcells famously had his kind of guys, right? He'd bring on a football team, not necessarily the best players, not necessarily all pros, but they were just his kind of guys that were kind of the gospel according to Parcells, kind of the guys that were good culture builders, the guys that were good standard setters. He did that with the Giants and the Patriots, the Jets, and of course later with the Dallas Cowboys. Kenny Clark is that same kind of guy, right? Same kind of Parcells guy where he goes onto a football team. He just does the little things. He's a good example. He's a grown up. He's buttoned up, says all the right things in front of the media. I tell you what, obviously performance on the field matters, and we'll have to see how things look in the short, medium, and long term with both Clark and the Dallas Cowboys. But in terms of what he brings to the locker room and what he brings to the team, he checks every single box. He's been an outstanding addition, and I think will provide a lot of value, even more than what we see on Sundays, to this Cowboys team. Kenny Clark is looking like a better and better acquisition as each day goes on. All right, next report here is courtesy of Nick Harris at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Earlier in the week, Cowboys head coach Brian Schottenheimer said the team will try out T.J. Bass, Trevor Keegan, and Hakeem Adeniji at right guard in order to make up for Tyler Booker's absence. And has been reported it will officially be T.J. Bass at right guard on Sunday, per Brian Schottenheimer. That was always the expectation. I think this was just an opportunity for Schottenheimer to evaluate a couple players, to put them in a mix, get them some reps, things like that. But it was always going to be T.J. Bass. Bass is a good, solid backup. I mean, he's played more than 300 snaps over the past 2 seasons. The Cowboys have won games with Bass. He's played with Hoffman before. He played with Hoffman a lot in the preseason. Hoffman, of course, replacing Cooper Beebe as a starting center. Now, look, is having Beebe and Booker together better in terms of talent and probably better for the offense than having Hoffman and Bass here? Absolutely. But I think the Cowboys could do a lot worse. And I think what we're seeing now is, I know it's early and we're looking at, as much as the Cowboys have been injury riddled and there's been some duds in terms of performance and backup performance, but we're going to get to a defensive story in a second, but we're starting to see some depth shine through. And I'll be very curious to see how TJ Bass does against a good Packers defense going forward. But we've already started to see some depth guys kind of emerge when you look at this Cowboys roster, getting a little bit less top heavy. And look, it's going to be a multi-year process to unwind the top heaviness of the Cowboys roster, but we're starting to see some signs of it already. And I think that's obviously a good thing going forward. All right, this next report is courtesy of Adam Schefter. With CeeDee Lamb ruled out for Sunday night's game versus the Packers, the Cowboys elevated wide receiver Jalen Cropper from their practice squad. This made a lot of people disappointed because a lot of people, I think, wanted to see, maybe a young receiver. I think Holden's a guy that's a name that's thrown around a lot. I did some digging and I looked up what people were saying about Cropper. I'm not like an expert on his game or anything like that, but everyone says good special teams player, good blocker, does the little things, smart player, all that kind of thing, tries to play physical. And I think one of the things that the Cowboys did here, which I think is kind of smart, if you're elevating, like a number 5 wide receiver or something like that, you're talking about a guy who's going to make most of his playing time as a special teams guy, maybe in some blocking situations. And can you trust a guy to run the right route and if he's wide open to catch the football, right? Because if you're asking your number 5 wide receiver to make a lot of plays for you, you're done. You don't stand a chance. And I know a lot of people want to see, a guy like Holden or whatever, someone like that, for example. But the reality is you're looking for your number 5 wide receiver to do 2 things: play special teams and get wide open, run the right offense, and catch the football. That's it, right? If you're asking for your number 5 elevated wide receiver to, win one-on-one matchups and come down with 50, 60 yards receiving, ain't going to work out for you. So I understand why a lot of people wanted to see maybe some bigger name young guys, and I get the desire to see these guys play. But look, Cropper, I don't even know if he may not even get an offensive snap. He probably won't. I guess we'll see how the game goes out. He may get a few snaps before it's all said and done, but I doubt he's in the game plan. I'll say it like that. And I think one of the things with Cropper is that he gives you good special teams. He's a good blocker. And maybe he does get some snaps. Maybe he does get an opportunity to show his stuff. And look, I think one of the things that can happen with injuries, like I said a second ago, is you get some of these guys that just show up and they can do the little things. And if you look at the Cowboys wide receiver room, outside of, obviously Turpin and Lamb and Pickens doing some good things, the little things haven't been there, right? Tolbert's been inconsistent. He hasn't been a good blocker, right? You look at, of course, Mingo's hurt. He's banged up. We haven't seen him. Now's an opportunity, right? Ryan Flournoy Flournoy is going to get some opportunities this week. I think he's got I think you're talking about a guy that has a chance to maybe have an impact and be productive. I look at Flournoy as a guy to keep an eye on. I really do. I think he's a guy that will have a chance for this game, regardless of how it goes, to make a name for himself a little bit. So I'm excited to see that. But I think we're looking for a wide receiver, if you're Dallas, that can do the little things, that can block, right? That can play really good special teams, that's really smart, reliable hands when the opportunities are there. Because Tolbert, so far, not a great blocker, what we've seen this season, and he's been inconsistent with his hands, right? He's made a few plays, but he's been a little inconsistent. And the fact that they look at Jalen Cropper, I think they want to see if he can take advantage of some opportunities. Again, I don't know how much playing time he's going to get. I don't know how involved in the game plan he's going to be, but I think he's going to have a few opportunities. And, look, if he goes out there and does a good job blocking and, if he's wide open and catches a couple passes or makes a guy miss or something like that, then hey, maybe he deserves more playing time. And from every report I've seen in the Cowboys organization is they like the way he does the little things. And right now at the back half, the bottom half of the wide receiver depth chart, they're looking for guys who can do the little things. With Mingo out, obviously he ain't doing it. Tolbert's got a lot of question marks. So again, if Cropper can make his bones against the Packers and with some opportunities, good for him. I think I'm excited to see it. Again, we're not looking for a guy to make big plays and tilt a game on its head, right? I know a lot of people are hoping that for some of these young wide receivers, but that ain't going to happen, right? You're looking for a guy that can do the little things, and the Cowboys, based on the reporting in the organization, believe Cropper can do just that. All right, moving right along. This is per John Machota over The Athletic. Great reporter. Highly recommend you follow him on X or social media if you're looking for good Cowboys news. He says, Cowboys wide receiver George Pickens said he's expecting more double teams and running an increased route tree with CeeDee Lamb out. On if this is an opportunity to show his value. I really wouldn't say value. This is a team game. I just want the whole team to win. On how he's played the first 3 games, I feel like I played good, but it's nothing if the team doesn't play good. I just want to get the victory. Nothing he says here is false, but one thing I want to point out here is there's a lot of people in Pittsburgh and a lot of people in the media by extension that said George Pickens was a malcontent, he just not a team guy, and everything he's done with Dallas has been the exact opposite. He's a fiery, competitive guy, and look, can he commit a dumb penalty every now and then? Of course, right? That was a question mark with Pickens, but to a man, every single person, Schottenheimer, Prescott, and now Pickens himself, people in the media have said, good locker room guy. People love him in the locker room. He's fitting right in. He's a team guy first and foremost. He's not a guy that's like begging for the football in terms of needing 15, 16 targets. Through 3 games, and of course this is a big opportunity for him, but through 3 games, he's done a lot of good things. Over the course of the CeeDee Lamb injury, I think it'll be very interesting to see what he does. If he can be a productive guy, he's definitely a guy the Cowboys should definitely sign and extend, because one of the big question marks for the Dallas Cowboys, really going back to the 2022 season, was who do you play at receiver opposite of CeeDee Lamb, right? 2022, Michael Gallup returning from injury, that was the goal, but he never really came back to form. 2023, listen, they had Brandon Cooks, who was decent, but at the end of his career, he just wasn't the same guy. 2024, it was, Brandon Cooks was injured, and then it was a bunch of just trying to figure it out. It was Jalen Tolbert, right? A lot. So not ideal in that position. So who's going to be the long-term number 2 opposite of Pickens? It's a big question mark. Turpin's the long-term weapon X. We see that, right? Ferguson, they think, is a long-term tight end. Got it. That makes sense. They want to figure out who the number 3/4 wide receiver is, the guy who can do the little things, right? I think whether that's Tolbert, whether that's Flournoy, whether that's Mingo, whether that's maybe Cropper, that's still up for debate. But number 2 wide receiver, Pickens can do some good things, and it's not going to it doesn't hinge on Green Bay, it doesn't hinge on 1 or 2 games. But if he can be a good locker room guy and be a productive, solid number 2 to CeeDee Lamb, you talk about a guy that's definitely worth extending. Absolutely love his mentality in the organization. All right, next report here is courtesy of Patrick Walker at Voice of the Star, another great follow on social media. Stephen Jones tells 105.3 The Fan that Cowboys will mostly deploy Deron Bland at outside corners return, not nickel. I think this is sort of the right move. If this is actually what the Cowboys do, I think it makes sense. If you look at the weakness of the Cowboys secondary, what's interesting, I went back and looked at the data and I said, okay, who is getting targeted the most over the first 3 games, right? And the answer shouldn't surprise anyone. It's Kaiir Elam by a mile. And in second place is Donovan Wilson by a mile, right? Trayvon Diggs has had a bad first 3 games. I think he had a good week 1 and a really bad week 2 and week 3. But he's been targeted like 7 times or 6 times. Like he's actually on a per snap basis been okay. And he's actually tackled okay. The problem is he's had a couple really dud plays. He's had a couple disaster plays, and he hasn't made any big plays in terms of interceptions or forced fumbles or things like that. But if you look at on actually the course of an entire game, no one's really picking on Diggs, right? The way they're picking on Elam. They're like maybe waiting for the right moment. They're like, okay, we got our good receiver one-on-one with Diggs, and we'll attack him and see if we can get a big play. I mean, that may happen like once a game, once a half, something like that. But people are picking on Kyer Elam every single snap. They're going after him in the same way they're going after Donovan Wilson. And I think that's a real problem for Dallas. And I think Deron Bland playing on the outside could help with that somewhat. Obviously, he's a lot better than Kyer Elam. I think is he perfect? Is he Darrelle Revis or anything like that? No. So expecting Deron Bland to come in and turn this passing defense from really terrible into really good overnight just isn't going to happen. But I do think he's a massive improvement. And look, Reddy Stewart got some opportunities as a nickel corner with the injury to Bland and a lot of the injuries to some of their other corners at depth. Right? Remember, they've got three, backup guys, Carson, Revel, and of course Butler, that are supposed to be like the core backup of their secondary. That's all been hurt, right? So they basically been out 4 of their top 6 corners to start the season over the past 2 games, which is not a good position to be in when you already have massive secondary issues and pass rush issues, right? Not a great spot. But when you look at the Cowboys going forward, Deron Bland returns. Revel should return to practice soon. Kalen Carson should return to practice soon once he gets off IR, which should happen after week 4. So we're starting to see some of the cavalry arrive. Butler's coming as well. In terms of seeing what the depth of this cornerback room looks like. Kyer Elam was one of these guys. He came in, had a decent little camp. It's one of those things, though, you have to kind of take training camp stuff and remember that, listen, you may have a good camp. You may be doing good things, but it's different when you then become a starting quarter against a team's number 1 receiver and you get picked on, right? Because that's not going to happen at training camp. You may get one-on-one reps against a number 3 or 4 receiver and not get picked on and have a few good plays and say, hey, listen, we got a good depth guy, right? And I think the context of Kyer Elam was we've got a good depth guy. We got a veteran guy who can be our number 4 corner, number 3 corner with the injuries we have at that position, right? And that was part of it, right? They brought in Kyer Elam because they needed a veteran because Diggs was hurt. Right, they knew Revel they drafted was hurt. They knew Butler was hurt, and then when Carson got hurt, it definitely reared its ugly head. So they just needed a guy that could line up and play, and that's what Kyer Elam has been. He's just been quite awful, to be totally fair. I don't mean to pick on him, but that's just the truth. I think Deron Bland getting most of his reps on the outside makes sense. I don't mind mixing it up every now and again, of course, but if Reddy Stewart is more than ready to be the nickel, and he's done some good things the last 2 weeks, keep him at nickel, keep Bland and Diggs on the outside, and then when Revel and Carson and Butler come back, start mixing up a little bit from there. And I think we're going to see a Cowboys secondary look a little bit different, hopefully Sunday night, but definitely long term. And that's one of the things I've talked about a lot is that, listen, the Cowboys secondary you see in the month of September, and I've said this going back months now, isn't going to be the secondary you see, at the end of the year or certainly in the future, right? Because look, going into the season, there was Diggs' injury, and of course, after Bland got hurt and the other cornerback injuries that I mentioned, if you ask the Cowboys front office and the coaching staff their long-term plan on corner, they probably would say, yeah, we're looking at Butler being a depth guy, we're looking at Revel, Diggs, and Bland being our 3 starters, and Carson and Elam kind of, duking it out for depth. Right, that's sort of what their thought was. Instead, they basically said, "Hey, Kyer Elam, you're playing every snap." Right, that wasn't their plan, that wasn't their strategy, and we're going to hopefully start to see in a little bit of that tonight, but definitely going forward, more of their actual strategy at cornerback, their actual plan of how they built this roster come to fruition. Now, whether it will work out or not, that remains to be seen, but at least to remember what we've seen through the first month of the season, the first 3 games up to this point, and even through tonight, remember, because still all those other guys are still hurt, we still haven't seen what they're supposed to look like in terms of what they've tried to build this cornerback room. We haven't seen that yet, and I think that's important to remember. All right, and finally, this report here, I thought it was interesting, saw this on a Bears reporter. He posted, bad news, if Caleb Williams and the Bears have a good game, no one is going to see it. Good news, if Caleb Williams and the Bears have a bad game, no one is going to see it. And he posted a map of CBS's 4:30 Eastern time coverage map here of who's going to watch which game. Most of the country is going to be watching, the vast majority of the country, like 99% of it, is going to be watching the Ravens at the Kansas City Chiefs, which would make sense. That's a great game, great matchup. Both teams desperate for a win. And then pieces of the country is going to watch the Bears at the Raiders, which basically is like the state of Illinois and some other parts of the Midwest, a little chunk there. Not even the entire state of Illinois, really. Just sort of, it's basically the greater Chicago area and then like the western half of Nevada. And that's it. That's the only people that are watching in terms of being on TV. The Bears play the Raiders. But the reason I bring this up, guys, and people are like, why are you talking about this game, the Bears-Raiders game? Because it's important to understand the context. The Raiders and the Bears are 2 historical franchises, right? Two historical franchises. Now, are they at the level of Dallas? No. But the Bears, one of the founding franchises. They're a historic team. They always have been, right? The Raiders, very similar, right? Just win, baby. The Raiders, they just have always gotten a lot of attention, right? If you ask me who are the 8 teams, the top 8 teams that define the NFL, right? No particular order. It would be the Cowboys, right? It would be the Packers. It would be the 49ers, those 3 right there. It would be the Giants. It would be the Cowboys, 49ers, Packers, the Giants, the Steelers. You would look at the Raiders. You would look at the Bears. And I know a lot of people don't like this, but I'd probably say the Cleveland Browns just because of what they meant to the early part of the National Football League for a long time. Now, you could argue maybe Browns are no longer on that list. I get it. But those, to me, at least the top 6 or 7, I think are fair. But despite that, again, we're talking about 2 of the top 8 franchises historically, and they're not even putting them on TV. And that's what happens when you get the Cowboys. People wonder, why is there so much Cowboys hate in the media? Why do the Cowboys get attacked all the time? Because that's all anyone sees, right? You have 2 historic franchises here in the Bears and the Raiders. The Bears, exciting young quarterback, exciting head coach, a lot of talent, right? They're kind of a fun, spunky team so far. How good could they be? The Raiders, right? They've got a new coach. They got a new lease on life. They've got good players, exciting young players. Ashton Genty, right? A maverick kind of head coach in Pete Carroll, a veteran quarterback in Geno Smith, right? It's both teams need a win. It's a similar situation, by the way, in terms of win-loss records as the Ravens and Chiefs, but no one's going to talk about it. No one's going to show it on TV. It just speaks to the levels here that we see in the National Football League. And people wonder, why is Dallas talked about all the time? Why do so many people hate Dallas? Because you have 2 historic franchises in a big game situation for both teams, and no one's going to see it, and no one's going to care. That's the difference between the Dallas Cowboys and everyone else, right? The Dallas Cowboys are on a whole nother level. It isn't even close. And look, that's when it comes to being a Cowboys fan, like my joke about that is that's a bad thing, because all anyone ever talks about is the negativity from it, because people in the media, ESPN, Fox Sports, for personal reasons or whatever reasons, because they don't like the Cowboys, but they're forced to talk about it because they dominate the coverage map. They dominate the games. They dominate in terms of getting all the clicks and attention. So that's why you get so much Cowboys hate, right? One of these teams, the Bears or the Raiders, is going to be a historical franchise, and they're going to lose, and no one is going to care. No one is going to talk about it outside of their fan bases, right? With the Dallas Cowboys, win, lose, or draw, everyone's going to talk about it. It just speaks to the difference here. That just, again, the Bears, Raiders, like hugely valuable, massive franchises, new stadiums, right? We're talking Las Vegas and Chicago, 2 iconic American cities, right? It just, everything you would look for in a matchup potentially, and nobody cares. Nobody cares. Everybody cares with Dallas. It just speaks to the difference between where the Cowboys are and where everybody else is, and it's not even close, for better or worse. All right, let's get into the comments from yesterday. As we always like to on this channel, we highlight the member comments first because I greatly appreciate the members. I promise the members, as always, is that if you become a member to support me, and I greatly appreciate it if you can and do, is I will always respond to your comments, and I will respond to them first. I will respond to all of the member comments before I get to the non-member comments. Obviously, time permitting, I'm going to try and get to as many comments as I can, but I will not necessarily get to all the non-member comments. I will get to every single comment from a member. So if you want to make sure you get your voice heard, or if you want to support the channel, or both, become a member. Big fan of our members. And before I get into the comments, I've been getting some feedback and like where it'd be good to like maybe show the comments on the screen in front of you guys while I kind of read them off. So I'm going to work on doing that this coming week, where instead of just seeing me, just my face right now reading off comments and talking to them, I'm going to start showing them on the screen. I'm going to set that up over the coming days. So I appreciate the feedback and insights on that, and that is coming in short order. But without further ado, let's get into the comments. This first one is from David Dobbins, 5887. And Dobbins says here, I'd put Blue in, talking about Jaden Blue. We need some speed, and Sanders ain't it. I'd also put Holden in because Pickens has speed, but Tolbert and Flournoy are both plotters. I need speed, and Turpin is a $1.25. Elam has a safety. Interesting thought. Also on the tight end, when in a dime, Fowler sits and brings on the blitz. Much more Houston, much more easy. Talking about Ezeraku. Williams blitzing from the linebacker. Thomas and Bell in at safety. More Maris, Leofau, and Shamar James. These guys are eyeball testing way higher than their peers, in my honest opinion. I agree with a lot of what you said there. I think obviously they decided not to go Holden, and I mentioned that and talked about that before. I think this was because they're looking for these receivers right now to do the little things, right? I think this is a Pickens evaluation moment. I think this is a Turpin evaluation moment, and now is not the time in their mind, and I don't disagree with it, to try and force feed a number 5 wide receiver, right? You want a guy in there in Cropper who can play special teams and do the little things and block, right? That's what you get at number 5 receiver. At this, eventually you can become a bigger impact player over time, but you have to earn your reps by doing the little things. Tolbert has struggled in that regard. I think they expect Cropper to maybe make more plays in that element. So that's why they're going that direction. You do bring up an interesting point about, getting a little more speed and eyeball testing and things like that. And I think one of the problems that the Cowboys defense has, and we kind of alluded to it over this week, is because they've been so awful, is that it's so hard to make, wholesale changes. So, right, if you're looking at communication issues, right, the cornerback position, bad. Safety position, bad. Linebacker position, bad. But you can't literally change everything, right? Because you're trying to figure out what the variable is, what the problem is. So you change, like testing, like you're doing a lab experiment. You change one variable and measure the result, right? It's old school stuff going back to like middle school for all of us, right? But if you wholesale change everything at once, or make, it's one thing to make 1 or 2 changes. Hey, we're going to change a scheme and maybe a personnel or 2. But if you change out everything at once, you have no idea if it works. What was a successful change? If it doesn't work, what didn't work? Do you have to revert everything back, or do you just change 1 or 2 pieces? So I think that's the problem the Cowboys are in, because their secondary and their coverage has been so bad and just so awful through the first 3 weeks, specifically the last 2. Is that they haven't been able to really, honestly, put in a whole lot of different guys. They can't sit there and, pull out a Murray and Sanborn completely and go Leah Fowle and Shamar James completely and say, hey, we need to see these guys get more reps, because that could be a disaster for their coverage. And now you don't know if your coverage is doing the right thing, right? So it becomes this weird world where there's so many problems that you can really only change a couple at a time. It seems like they're making a few changes this week, hopefully to see some more. I think over the course of a long season, we'll see more personnel changes as the Cowboys kind of work through. I expect a lot less of Sanborn and Murray as the season goes on, certainly when Overshown returns. Leah Fowle's getting some reps and getting some opportunities. Want him to get more. Want to see him get more opportunities going forward. But again, I think the big challenge for the Cowboys defensively is because they've been so bad in terms of edge rusher, linebacker play, and secondary play in general, is that you can't really change everything all at once, because how are you going to evaluate what worked if it does work? And if the Cowboys defense still sucks if you do that, well, does that mean everyone you brought in sucked, or just different players? It creates a challenging environment, and that's what really stinks, right? It's one thing if you're like, okay, our corners are terrible, we need to bring in some new corners, right? But it's multiple levels and multiple positions, so it's really hard to figure out what is the solution, right? Do the Cowboys, for example, does Jadeveon Clowney solve the pass rush? It won't. I don't think it will, but let's say it does, and he becomes a superstar pass rusher. Suddenly the Cowboys are a good pass rushing team. And Deron Bland, does a better job at corner than Elam as we expect, and suddenly the secondary is better. I mean, that could be enough right there, right? But let's say you had also made those changes, and then you swapped out Leah Fowle and Shamar James in at the same time, and suddenly now you have coverage issues at the linebacker room, and you give up a lot of big plays because of that. I'm not saying that would happen, but just hear me out there. Well, now you look at it and say, well, maybe Bland wasn't the solution. Maybe Clowney wasn't the solution, even though they're playing well. So it becomes a weird environment where you can't just wholesale change everything. I like starting with small incremental changes on a week-by-week basis. It seems you're going to be doing some of that, see how it works, and then make more changes going forward. I think that's the process they're taking. All right, this next comment is from Plague Doctor. I agree with the other commenter and hope Dallas takes more calculated risks in free agency. I don't think Carr should have soured them on the process. Talking about the Brandon Carr deal from a long time ago, from 2010, 2011, something like that. He was steady and dependable. Even if he never reached superstar level, he never was hurt. Overpaying is part of free agency, and Carr's contract looked bigger than his production. But with today's contract structures and the rising salary cap, teams have more flexibility to manage those deals without wrecking their roster. Great point there. I do think there's one of the issues the Cowboys have had, and I think this kind of lurks in the back of their front office minds, is because they were really good at drafting and developing, I think they felt it was better served to hold on to some of those cap space for locking down their veterans. I think that was sort of the Jason Garrett era. And it kind of worked for a few seasons, but I do agree now's the time to be more aggressive in free agency, right? And I think one of the things that people sort of forget is that it just wasn't Carr, right? In terms of stars they locked down that didn't work out. You look at Van Der Esch with the injury, Jalen Smith didn't work out, right? I mean, there's a lot of guys the Cowboys extended and spent a lot of money on where it just was a total dud. And look, it happens to everybody, but I think that's one of the reasons why I think Jerry Jones in the front office is reticent to do it, but they do need to change. They got the cap space now. Now there is no excuse, right? You're locking down on quality players, with relatively good deals up to this point. Not all of them will work out, but I think most of them will. So now's the time to be more aggressive in free agency. They've got the cap space to do it. I think it's the right move to make. Again, the moment they basically extend Aubrey and potentially extend Pickens, they're good on veterans for like 3 years. So you're going to have a lot of opportunities. Plus, with all the first round picks and 6 picks in the first 2 rounds of the next 2 seasons, you're going to have a lot of young guys on cheap deals. So you're going to have a lot of opportunity to bring in veterans. I hope to see them be more aggressive in free agency. All right, let's get to the non-member comments here. This first one is from the BizCore 9315. When Revel and Obershone come back, we will be good on defense again. Then all you need is a fix at free safety room and another pass rusher on the other side of Clowney. With all the picks, players, and money, we can get that easily. And then on offense, you need to replace Steele, and then you have a Super Bowl team. Yeah, I love the optimism. I do think when Revel and Overshown, if they can come back and be as good as you would expect or advertise, they will be a much better defensive team. That's just a fact. I do think they definitely need safety help, and I think they do need to look at the right tackle position and pass rusher and potentially another linebacker. But the great news is for Dallas is that they could literally do that in next year's draft. They could literally go safety in the first round. I'm just making this up. Safety in the first round, right tackle in the first round, and a second round edge rusher, and then sign a veteran linebacker or something like that. And then you're there, right? You're there. And then you have 2 more first round picks the next year. And it's one of those things where they have that flexibility. It's all the problems that they have on their roster are so solvable now. I remember for a long time, for really the past 4 or 5 years, maybe even further back than that. Honestly, if you go back really since the Amari Cooper trade, all the flaws they've had on their roster didn't feel solvable, right? They drafted in the middle or last half of the first round most years, right? They didn't have the draft. They had to rely on, a Tony Pollard being a mid-round draft pick becoming a stud or something like that, right? They had to hit on all their first rounders. CeeDee Lamb was a hit, perfect. Smith was a hit, perfect. Mozzie Smith, not a hit, right? Didn't work out, right? Guyton, we have to wait and see. So it's one of these things where when you have to hit on every first round pick, it's just hard because just statistically speaking, first round picks normally are a 50-50 bet, right, across the National Football League. The Cowboys have been better than that, but that's just what it averages out to. So if you have to hit on every first rounder when the league average hit rate is 50%, it is a tough road to hoe, and that's what the Cowboys were finding themselves in. Now they no longer have to rely on that, which I think is a good sign for their future. All right, here, Garland McGregor commented, what's happening with Perry and Winfrey? And then, we got one of our viewers commented. Thank you for jumping in here. Leland Chandler, 4265, said he's on IR with an injury. Yeah, he's hurt, right? It's, again, another injury up front. It's one of those things, injuries just happen in the National Football League. It stinks, but it's just the way it is right now with Dallas. Anchors Away 9893 commented, I would like to see Blue play. He is as fast as Turpin. A lot of people want to see Jaden Blue play, and I think I'm one of them at this point, right? I was a little, let's not get him early in the game, early in the season, right? Let's let him figure it out. But based on what Schottenheimer's saying, he should start getting playing time sooner rather than later. I want to see him hitting the field, right? And look, work through the lumps. You got to see what you got at a certain point with Jaden Blue, right? You kind of know what you have with Sanders, and that's good. Let's get some opportunities for Jaden Blue, especially with Lamb out. Maybe it makes sense to do that now. The Anchors Away went on a comment. A lot of people say Dallas or Green Bay lost on the trade. I happen to feel that both sides actually won. Green Bay got an elite pass rusher, very true. Dallas got a leader, very true, and a run stopper along with first round picks, very true. I get to feel that culture is starting to change. So far, I'm impressed by Shoddy. Yeah, it's one of those things that's very interesting is that if you look at the people always talk about with Dallas, they look at the Jimmy Johnson turnaround or the Bill Parcells turnaround. But what's very interesting is what the Cowboys have done is actually more akin to what the Detroit Lions did with Dan Campbell, right? Dan Campbell comes, takes over the franchise, and they say, listen, we're gonna be a physical football team. We're gonna change the culture. And they were terrible, right? I think they were like 0-10 or 0-9-1 or 0-11, whatever it was. Their first year there, they won a few games at the end. They got off to a terrible start year 2 in 2022, finished the season strong, and then 2023, 2024, now 2025, they're a good football team, right? It takes time. It takes draft picks. And what did the Lions do? They had a star quarterback in Matthew Stafford, one of the best players in their franchise history. They traded him to a contender in the NFC, sound familiar? For a seemingly lesser player, Jared Goff, and a lot of draft picks and cap space. That's what the Lions did, and it worked out well for them. The Cowboys, same approach, same strategy. Will it work out well for them? Time will tell. But I do think the culture change and the long-term trajectory approach is the way to go. You ask Lions fans today who won the trade, they say they do. But like you bring up here, you ask Rams fans today who won the trade, they say they do. And I think, like you mentioned here, Anchors Away, great comment, great point, that both people here believe they won the trade. And I think long-term, it may look like that. Let's see here. Arch Fit 8271 commented, Maris Leofau staying on the field 80% of the snaps will make a big difference. I don't like Matty putting his progression on the back burner to play his guys and hoping they prove him right. Yeah, that is probably my biggest annoyance with Eberflus, to be honest, is how he's handling the linebacker position. And look, I'm not a defensive coordinator in the National Football League, right? So obviously Eberflus knows more about football than I do. But that's sort of one of my frustrations, right? Look, we know Sanborn and Murray, everyone knows they're not playing well. It's obvious, right? They're not playing well. Now, could Maris Leofau be worse with more playing time? Sure, certainly could be, but not really that much worse because neither Sanborn or Murray are playing well. So I think it all depends on what position Overshown will have. If Overshown is taking, let's say, Sanborn or Murray's spot when he's healthy, if that's the plan, then I can understand, okay, you want to kind of keep Leofau as that third outside linebacker because it makes no sense to give him inside reps and then have Overshown take his spot in a few months anyway, right? So I kind of get that. But if you have Overshown, if he's going to be the outside linebacker, then why the heck aren't you giving Leofau more reps? It's definitely something to keep an eye on going forward. I think Maris Leofau every single guy talks great things about him, says he's smart, says he's a playmaker and all this kind of thing. And no one's saying he's elite, but if he's all these things, then why isn't he getting more opportunities? I think that's one disconnect right now with the Cowboys defensive coaching staff that I can't reconcile. And look, maybe we'll know Sunday night. Who knows? But I do agree that it's a big question and big concern in my mind. Let's see here. Lee Cooper 1322 commented, I cannot understand why the heck we drafted Blue and made a big deal about him, but won't play him. Shotty keeps talking about consistency. I understand that, but he's never going to get truly consistent until you play him. I watched all of his Texas games. He is a beast. He's fast. He can catch out of the backfield. He can block. Play him, Shotty. Let's see what he's made of. Hope you guys agree. Hashtag DC for life. Well, I mean, I don't disagree, but let's back up to, let's say, 2004, right, with Bill Parcells when he drafted Julius Jones in the second round. Julius Jones, the first few games of the season, didn't get a whole lot of opportunities and then got hurt. And then the second half of the season, he got a lot of opportunities down the stretch, right? They had Eddie George. The Cowboys had Eddie George. They signed Eddie George in the offseason prior to the 2004 season. And they gave Eddie George a lot of carries early on. And then as the season progressed, they went heavy on Julius Jones when they figured out Jones could play and he came back from injury and things like that. I think we're seeing a similar kind of approach here with Jalen Blue. I know a lot of people are anxious to see him play, but I think I'm expecting eventually he will and get some significant reps. And maybe it starts Sunday night. Who knows? I kind of doubt it, to be honest. I think it's 50-50, but I think sooner rather than later, we'll see Jalen Blue hit the field and start getting some touches. Because, look, it's not like he wasn't. Julius Jones was a second-round pick. He was the Cowboys' first selection in the 2004 NFL draft. So he was actually forced onto the field much earlier. Jalen Blue obviously was nowhere near the first selection for the Dallas Cowboys. He did get a lot of media attention, but he's a Texas kid, right? He's a running back position was a big question mark for Dallas over the course of the offseason in the past couple seasons. So he got a lot more attention than you would normally expect from a player that was selected where he was picked. But that being said, I do expect him to eventually get more playing time down the stretch for Dallas. Let's see here. David Baker, 5701, commented, Jones as a CEO has created a license for the NFL to print money. Very true. As a GM for a professional football team, he was never qualified. His finest moment as a GM was when he wrote the checks as Jimmy instructed him to do so. His inability to understand this keeps him from retaining good coaching and has contributed to the long Super Bowl drought. Jerry makes the same amount whether Dallas wins or not. Well, I think if they won, he'd probably make a little bit more, but it's certainly a whole lot of money, right? His net worth is not going to drop by billions of dollars if the Cowboys lose. We've seen that, of course. Obviously, it's gone up even when the Cowboys lose over the past couple seasons. I think it's a fair criticism. The one thing I would say about Jerry Jones, and this is sort of interesting, is that he's sort of the public face, but he doesn't handle really the day to day as much as he used to. At least it doesn't seem that way. And the reporting seems to say that he's handled a lot of stuff to Will McClay and handled a lot of stuff to Stephen Jones. I mean, he still has a massive input, but I think that Jerry Jones' heavily involvement that we saw in, say, 2006 is not nearly the same as we see today, right? He's delegated a lot more over the past couple seasons, past couple decades, if we're being honest. Now, I think he's still too involved, but I think right now he's much more of a figurehead at GM than he actually is the real GM. I think Will McClay, I think if you to back up here, I think if you would have said in 2005, Jerry Jones is 99% GM. Now in 2025, I would say he's probably about 50%. Will McClay is probably about 40%, and Stephen Jones is about 10. Now he still has a big voice. He's still 50%, but we're seeing him delegate more and more, and I think that trend will continue. And whether that's good or bad, we'll find out in very short order. Okay, let's this is El Hernandez 857. I think this is an interesting comment. He said, I want to stop by and say that even though I'm not a member, I can honestly say that I've watched many YouTube influencers in quotation marks that talk about the Cowboys. I would say all of the influencers, I only watch and listen to 3 or 4 of them, now with you being my number one source of news. Oh, thank you. I'm with you on ESPN and Fox News. They hype up their favorite team and trash who they don't care for. I think the media reports news on emotions rather than stating the facts. I 100% agree. I really hope they get better, but they never will until they figure out why. The sad thing is why obvious people speak of emotions that ESPN and Fox both probably don't want to say anything that hurts reporters' feelings. That's just the overall problem today. Yeah, 100%. I think there's a lot of people that are these commentators and talking heads that are just, I don't know if they're ill prepared or just wrong, but no one wants to call them out and say, look, you're just being an idiot, dude. And I think that's, in terms of internal to that organization, I'm not talking about like a debate on a show. So I think the fact that the organizations themselves, the executives themselves aren't saying, listen, man, you're saying stupid crap. Can you cut it out? That hasn't happened yet, at least not wholesale. Comment goes on to say, fun fact, I have to tell you as a 50-year-old lifelong Cowboys fan who remembers watching the Cowboys having cousins, grandparents, sisters, brothers under one roof was amazing. I still remember when Danny White was playing, they show highlights of Roger Staubach and they go into what we call a bomb, the Hail Mary, and how it's got a game. It still excites me today when he says, well, we are down, I draw back receivers running deep, and I started reciting the Hail Mary prayer, and the invention of the Hail Mary bomb was born. Anyway, keep the great work, brother. You deserve the praise you receive from those who truly watch and listen to your content. I'm glad I found your channel. Yeah, so one of my things, and one of the reasons I want to highlight this comment, and not just because he says nice things about me, I mean, I appreciate it, but that's not what this is about. I love the fact that he brought up the family connection and the history with the Dallas Cowboys. And look, I wasn't around for the Hail Mary game, obviously, 1975. I know the history behind it, 14-10. They convert a 4th down play a few plays before to Pearson on the sideline against Minnesota. The drop pass from Preston Pearson, right? The lore, right? He underthrows a deep ball down the sideline. Pearson makes the catch, and Staubach after the game says, "I closed my eyes and said Hail Mary," and it just speaks to, I think, the history of the game and the connection that the Cowboys have at a level that no other team except maybe the Pittsburgh Steelers have. I think that's where the Cowboys and the Steelers have an interesting connection. You could probably throw the Packers in there too, but it's a little bit different because there was such a gap with Green Bay. Between Lombardi to Brett Favre, we're talking 30 years where there was just nothing interesting that happened at all with Green Bay. But we've seen the Cowboys and the Steelers just historically, whether it was the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even though the Cowboys haven't won a championship, they've been relevant and at least a conversation piece for the past 20 years as well, with a lot of postseason flubs and disappointments. And I think that's the great thing about being a Cowboys fan, is the connection to the past and the connection to family and stories and things like that. And even when the seasons don't go well, and even when they do go well, I think those are the connections that in the long term, I think that's what really matters, right? And I think just having those memories and things like that. A lot of my favorite memories, I'll give you an example. It was 2005. It was the game against the Chiefs. It was a back and forth game. It was a great game. And it was 34-31 with like 10 seconds to go or something like that. And they threw a deep ball to Dante Hall to get in field goal range, tie it up and go to overtime, and he missed the kick. And for whatever reason, I've never been more excited in my life, right? We're talking 20 years ago now. I was obviously a kid at that point. And just at that moment, me and my dad were celebrating and high-fiving and something like that. It was like a regular season game. We were definitely way too excited for the outcome of that kind of game. But it just speaks, just a memory that speaks with me. I also have a memory, in the same season, by the way, of the 2 Santana Moss bombs on Monday Night Football when Dallas was up 13-0 and Madden and Al Michaels talked about how Bill Parcells had never lost a game while leading double digits in the fourth quarter, whatever the metric was. And I remember just kicking my feet up and saying, this feels good, and then immediately being devastated like 5 minutes later. And so those are the memories, those are the stories, those are the things that really matter. And I think, regardless of what happens tonight, I think it's going to be an interesting game. I'll put it like that. I think the long term and the connection we have as Cowboys fans to the history, to the game, and the history of our own families and of our own society, I think that's special. And I know we get caught up in the minutia and the nitnoid, and that matters too. And look, I talk about the minutia and the nitnoid, right? That's what I like talking about. But I think the high level here of what the Cowboys mean and its place in our own society, our own culture, and our own families, I think is really cool. And that's one of the reasons I like talking about them, right? Because it's actually something that, in a way, it matters, but it matters because it brings certain things to life. It brings things for us. It brings back memories. It brings back stories. It keeps us connected to our past. It keeps us connected in the present and allows us to keep an eye on the future. It's just an awesome thing. I just wanted to highlight that to wrap up today's show today. Great comment, sir. Thank you very much. All right. We'll see what happens tonight. Obviously, it's going to be like I said, an interesting game. We'll see how it all goes, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. And until then, I'm Nick, and this is Saturday Morning Inspection.